How did Lito get involved in PETA?
Okay. Lito started to join PETA after his college education in the University of the Philippines. So he was looking for a group that would nurture his interest in writing. And I believe that he met a member or one of the members of the Philippine Education Theater Association who invited him to be part of that. So he was very fortunate to have been mentored by the likes of Lino Broca and other artists in PETA who encouraged and helped hone his writing talent. So apart from venturing in writing, he also directed some of the plays. So that was up until the 70s. And now in the 80s, that was when he got interested in the movies. And the natural action was to speak to Lino Broca, his mentor, and ask him how he could, penetrate the movie industry. Because he thought that after seeing films like Maynila sa Kuko ng Liwanag and other unnotable films that were very powerful in conscientizing the people on issues in Philippine society, he thought that the movies or cinema was a very, very good medium for raising awareness. So Lino invited him to be his assistant director. He was very lucky to have Lino mentor him. So he did like more than 10 movies, easily 15 maybe. And so that was how he learned how to do filmmaking until he directed his own movies. In the early 80s, Techi Agbayani, who was like a budding actress, made her first, I think she was the first Filipina to become like a Playboy centerfold. So a producer, independent producer, took advantage of that situation to put together a movie entitled Hubad na Gubat, The Naked Forest. But it was actually an analogy of Philippine society, where Philippine society's natural resources and people were being raped by colonizers, by capitalists, and exploiters in general. So they got Techi Agbayani to star in the movie. So this was her first movie after her Playboy splash. And they got Lito to direct. So this is an independent producer, someone they know, a friend. And then Ed Maranan, bless his soul. So Edgardo Maranan wrote the script. So it was an excellent collaboration. But it was also a painful realization to Lito that even with progressive independent producers, at the end of the day, it was meant to make profit. So in the process of filmmaking, he was aghast to be told you have to show more breasts, the sex scene should be more sizzling, and then he realized that this is not for me. Commercial movie making is not for me because you really have to compromise. And I think his some of his core values like respect for women, generally, the concept of exploiting people just to make money really didn't sit well with him. So he said, that's going to be the last commercial movie that he's going to do. And that's when he decided to shift to documentary filmmaking.
So from this realization, how does he arrive in terms of the concerned artists of the Philippines and CABS? What happens in between?
Okay. So he has already been involved with concerned artists of the Philippines since he was a PETA member. So the concerned artists of the Philippines was a logical, choice for a lot of the progressive artists during the Marcos dictatorship. The CAP, in a way, galvanized all the artists from the different art forms. And Lito, who was then still with PETA, got involved. And then eventually, theater, he then became involved with CAP as part of the film sector.
How about one of the CAVs, I think, is accredited to having made Signos. Was he involved in that project, and what was his relationship to Broca and Mike De Leon at that time?
If I'm not mistaken, he was involved with Signos because I was aware that they were meeting. There were several meetings with Mike De Leon and with Lino. And I think they were just brainstorming and discussing, about doing a film that exposed the problems or the ills of Philippine society, the perspective of affected artists, in the Philippines. So that's really powerful because people tend to take seriously artists like Mike De Leon or Lino Broca. So I think there was a lot of brainstorming. So Mike made sure that he involved a lot of artists. I wouldn't be surprised if Pete Lacaba was also involved and other similar artists. But I'm not sure if he was directly involved in writing some of it, but for sure he was involved in some of the brainstorming. So that was how he got involved in Signos.
So understand at this point, Cavs is not a sort of a solid group. It's more of a loose formation. How are these different artists, including your husband, talking about developing something more permanent, like Asia Visions? Do you recollect any of the conversations?
I think there was a group of them. So this included Danny Consumido and Jose Quaresma, who thought that it was important for them to organize it as a formal entity. One, so that it could be legitimate. And second, so that they can acquire funding, which was also necessary for them to produce films. So I think that was a move that had to be made if they were to continue producing films like this. And because of the warm reception to Signos, I think they were inspired to do more of this. So, I mean, theater was there. It was doing a fantastic job of doing consciousness raising and, exposing a lot of the issues and, encouraging people to take action. But the films equally was a powerful medium for people to become aware, especially remember, this was not the age of social media. There was no internet yet. So it was very, very important for people to have access to facts and information, real accurate information. And film was a very powerful medium in that respect.
How about some of aside from the consciousness raising aspects of these docus, what were some of the ideas from theater that they carried over? Such as Bertolt Brecht's ideas and Augusto Ball, the theater of the oppressed.
Yeah.
If you look at Signos, there's Pete Lacaba translates one of Bertolt Brecht's poems and he puts it in there. There's some experimentation with the editing. How does that percolate through from theater to Super 8 short docus?
My husband started as a writer, so he believed using the same form, for example, just straight documentary, like just, covering a rally and publishing it as such is not very effective. So that's just an example. So he thought that for people to be attracted or for film to have an appeal, it can't be the same form, like just straight documentary. So he thought that Filipinos liked, like short stories or movies in general, like not necessarily documentary. So he believed in using stories to deliver messages, to deliver the truth, using creative forms, using language that's not replete with jargon or that's, only understood by the converted people or by like preaching to the choir, as they say. So he believed that they should be constantly looking for forms that would effectively deliver the same message so that people will be open to listen and to understand, what was being said.
Of course, the people we mentioned earlier, the filmmakers and artists we mentioned earlier, Broca, Mike De Leon, and Ishmael Bernal, you mentioned, are definitely artists. They're not working in documentary.
Yeah.
How does Lito navigate thinking about documentary coming out of this milieu of artists? Who are they're working very, very creatively and they have their individual distinctive styles.
Yeah. There is one form that was very appealing to Lito. It was cinema verite. And he believed that by capturing the everyday life of migrant worker, for example, in Hong Kong. First, of course, there is the process of making the person, your subject, comfortable with the camera so that at some point, the subject is no longer aware that, there's a camera capturing every moment. That if you capture the everyday ordinary life put it together in a way that would tell the story, a compelling story, and move people to, to act on it, and then he believes that, your work is done. So that particular form, cinema verite, I don't remember anymore which particular French director had a huge influence on him, but for sure, he was a big fan of that. He thought that, yes, you don't have to produce, cinema in the way that we produce movies now for the big screens. And that in fact, the everyday ordinariness of people, when put together well, could be also interesting and even powerful to the ordinary people.
Is that similar to like Lino Broca's "No Acting Please" concept, where there's an emphasis on non-professional actors and
I wouldn't be surprised if that had an influence on him, because Lino has, his mentor, and has been very influential in his creative thinking and process.
but perhaps also Lino was influencing Broca. In his film Bayan Ko Kapit sa Patalim, he's filming rally scenes live in a documentary style.
Yeah,
And of course, he weaves that into the cinema, the mise en scène.
yeah.
Do you think that's possibly also there's an exchange?
Could be that, and Ora Pro Nobis too, right? Ora Pro Nobis was Lina Broca's, yeah.
Yeah.
So Ora Pro Nobis also had scenes that were very, very close to, reality. So those rallies and confrontation or encounters, yes. So I guess yes, but probably not just Lito, but a lot of the directors too had also influenced Lino. But after all, Lino was part of the Asia Vision's board of trustees. So I'm sure that they were influencing each other very well.
How did Asia Visions get founded, and how did Lito Broca and Pete Lacabas, I think he's also sitting on the board.
Yes.
How did that come to happen?
I don't know the details, but well, first of all, at the get-go, they funded it from their own pockets. So because they didn't have funding at the get-go. So it's so funny because I remember that our bedroom was converted into an editing room and a projection room. So it's funny how, our resources at home were used to produce this, using Super 8 to produce Arrogance of Power. So that was the first output of Asia Visions. And I remember that, it really sent shivers. I saw it for the first time put together with so powerful images, and even the song Ako Ay Pilipino by Kula Desma. And then that's when I realized, indeed, film is such a powerful medium to deliver a scathing message that, this cannot go on. The abuses of this dictatorship cannot go on.
So you were watching, if the editing equipment's in your bedroom, you were watching this
Yes.
as it was put together. Who was involved, and what sort of a collaborative effort was it?
For Arrogance of Power, I honestly don't remember what was the creative process there, but I think Lito was, for most parts, was very much involved. I don't know if there were others. I don't know if it was at the brainstorming stage, initial brainstorming, or every step of the way did he consult, but which I doubt. I think the brainstorming happened in the beginning, and then he executed whatever the result of that brainstorming was. And I don't know how many times it was revised, but as far as I know, he was mostly the one involved in splicing it and putting it together. And yes, so I don't know. I'm sure that he consulted his core group at that time. So I think that was Joe Quaresma and Danny Consumido who were involved. Maybe also Pete Lacaba. I don't know to what extent Lino was involved, but maybe for their feedback on, the drafts that he produced. But I just saw him editing on its own. So I didn't notice that there was like a group working on, while it was being edited. So yeah, I'm not too sure about if there was like such collective process.
What was it like making a film like The Arrogance of Power at this time? It's 83 and 84, is that the years that it's... I think it's, I know it's shown in 1984, so I assume it's in the works prior to that.
Before Arrogance of Power, I don't recall that anything was shown publicly. So the first time I saw it, I thought, and it was in a rally, by the way. It was an indoor rally. It was, I think, in Christ the King, if I recall it right. So I think that was where it was shown for the first time. Because the images were so powerful. So these were actual footages of people who were salvaged, people who were tortured. They had access to real good footages. So these were, not reenactment, the actual events that unfolded. So it was very powerful because like you're witnessing things happening right under your nose. And then you realize that just too much abuse, there's just too much oppression, there's just too much abuse of human rights that you come to your senses and realize that this has to stop. It cannot go on. So I thought it was very, very powerful, especially when you combine both the sound bites as well as the music that they used. It was just so powerful. So the images were, and the message were just simply so powerful and it was in a very, very short period of time. So it was like less than 15 minutes, I think. But when you see footage upon footage of evidences, that all the atrocities, all the impunity that was happening, then it would really hit you so bad that something's got to change. This couldn't go on.
Would you consider Arrogance of Power more of a straight docu, or was it using, like you said earlier, creative forms to communicate?
No. This was straight docu. Tatacelo is an example of what I referred to as a more creative way of presenting the issues. So that was Tatacelo meant to present the agrarian issues. The cycle of indebtedness and poverty of peasants because of the issues of land, lack of credit, and then high interest rates, and then this abusive relationship with the landlords, etc. So that was using a short story to present the issues.
So kind of like the Sarsuela theater?
Yeah. Or just drama, straight drama. Yeah.
And so he felt that was a form that he was thinking about possibly when he was making Arrogance of Power.
Yes. So it was because Filipinos love soap operas. So this was, more drama, but at the same time, but it was contemporarized. So Tatacelo was set in the 50s. So this time it was set in the 70s or 80s.
Do you remember some of these questions of form and aesthetics are discussed at the Magkaisa 1 conference and symposia in 1984? I think Peda and Maloy Tiongson are two of the main organizers, CAPs involved.
Yeah.
Were you at that, and do you remember?
No, I wasn't a participant to that, but heard about. There's always that tension, form and content, and the question of when does it become propaganda, or aren't all things propaganda anyway? So I think that was the discourse at that time.
With the book that Maloy Tiongson writes it emphasizes. Of course, it has the proceedings of the conference, but what ends up being emphasized are the two themes like mass and nationalism. Were the in this debate about art and politics, were these themes ever seen as imposing upon the creative process? Were there other dominant themes or slogans that one felt one had to put in to the art because of the politics?
Yeah. Okay. I think my husband wouldn't mind if I tell you now that he used to identify himself with the National Democratic Movement. So he and I supported it very well, very much. So that was the politics. But as an artist, he felt that sometimes it's not productive or constructive to use big slogans such as imperialism, bureaucrat capitalism, and feudalism in presenting the issues. Because for one, these are big words, these are grand narratives which don't mean anything to the people. So if the objective is to make them aware, understand, doesn't help to use those big words. Sometimes it could be a turnoff because you are already identified with a certain spectrum and political groupings. So that was sometimes where he felt queasy about including those three slogans in his film. But there's pressure. Like a good supporter of the national democratic movement, there's the pressure to also popularize the terms because that's what identifies the movement. It's definition of what the causes of the problems in Philippine society are. So there's that constant tension. And we never got around to discussing, so how are you creatively going around that tension? Or how are you sorting out that tension or dilemma? So we never got around to, yes. It would be an interesting conversation when I meet him in heaven.
Do you remember or recall any debates about this, or was it not necessarily percolating up in conversation?
Not in our conversation, but not sure if I'm sure he would have these conversations with other artists, but not in public forums.
Right.
Yes, because it's not politically correct to expose these tensions, in open forums.
Did the tension make its way into any of the work, like Signos, for instance, or are there other films from this period, even Brocas, or that embody this tension or contradiction?
I think it was secondary, to be honest. It was a secondary issue because the principal objective was to arouse and organize and mobilize the widest number of people as much as possible. So these tensions actually were just secondary to what was the primary objective at that time, or the primary focus at that time. So I don't remember that it, got in the way or hindered. At least I wasn't aware of any. It hindered, the production of a film because of that tension. But I know that it was at the back of their minds. And I know that they were consciously finding how do you present so that you tone down on these slogans or big words. So I know that was, something consciously, they were thinking of. But perhaps, we never got to discuss it. Yeah.
At the Magkaisa One Symposium, what it seems like from reading the proceedings, everyone agrees that two major themes that need to be emphasized or stressed are this theme of the mass and this theme of nationalism. Yeah. Is that a compromise with the proposition that you only emphasize the slogans of imperialism, bureaucratic capitalism, and semi-feudalism?
Yeah. Maybe that was the way out. So it was emphasizing, okay, for one, well, first of all, nationalism. I think you can't speak of nationalism without having to go through those three ills. Because if you break it down, your nationalism stems from your opposition to foreign intervention, your opposition to, 80% of the Philippines being agriculture, and, the oppressive relationship, exploitative and oppressive relationship between the landlords and the peasants or the masses, etc. I think it's a creative solution to that rather than three words. So nationalism, which is a very attractive proposition. And in a way, rather than speak of imperialism, you're emphasizing your loyalty or your dedication to your, to your own country, to your race, etc. So that's nationalism. But for the mass, I think, and that has also been emphasized, that you always end the message with the people's action or the people's response. So I think that's what my understanding is, that's what we mean by mass, to emphasize that people are leading whatever action is being done to address the social ills in Philippine society. So it's not something that is, as perceived by some, led by the middle class, but these are the basic sectors asserting their self-determination, their emancipation. So I think, yes. So I think it's not a compromise, but I think it's a creative way to depart from that tension. So yes.
I'm wondering if the subsequent films that were made by Asia Visions, like the Mendiola Massacre, there you sort of see the mass in the rally, and you have the nationalist slogans. on one hand, but on the other hand, I think there is also a creative treatment to that, the way that's edited together. Um, what do you remember about that film, and uh, what was Lito thinking about when working on that film?
For one, let me just put it out there that it was a very emotional time for him because Lito comes from a family of farmers. So his father came from the had peasant origins, although he was able to accumulate lots of land. So he had a strong affinity with the peasant sector. So it was heartbreaking for him to see dead bodies or wounded bodies. And at some point, he said that they stopped to act as filmmakers, but had to do the right thing, which is to bring the bodies, or at least those who survived, to the hospital. So he was involved in, carrying the bodies to their van. It was a Fiera, like, it's like the AUVs now, Asian Utility Vehicles. So they were piled up and they brought them to the Philippine General Hospital. So just to say that, yeah, so that interfered in the process of filming Mendiola, and they just had to do it. I mean, there was, no second thoughts about it. Now, in terms of filming or editing, I think it was just rich material. It says it all. Even the lady crying there, who was part of their team, she was my colleague, by the way, who was accompanying her husband, who was part of Asia Visions. So she was crying and then, like wailing when she witnessed how the peasants were being killed, were being shot at. So I think all the elements were there. So it was just a matter of making sure that, there was no overindulgence in terms of just overstretching it, and that the emotions were reflected or were communicated, as well as, just enough for the viewer to realize, that it was such, a horrible, horrible thing that didn't have to happen. I think, you know what? I don't recall him saying that it was difficult for him to put it together, because everything was there. Everything was shot. I mean, everything was filmed, and unfortunately, like I think you are aware that one of their team members was shot at. So, and that was also part of it when the camera fell because he was shot. So, I mean, it shows there that no one was spared, even those who were just doing a job of filming it. Everyone was fair game to the military.
The shot where that you're speaking of, where Joy Clemente gets shot, the editor leaves in the camera going upside down.
Yeah.
And for me, it was almost as if the world had turned upside down. And you see this represented in the documentary, actually in a way that's kind of experimental, because they certainly could have decided to show something else.
Yeah.
And going further, unfortunately, it's a defeat for the KMP as a rally, as a political protest. It's not successful. So I guess what does it mean for the movement after this happens, and is the film like an accurate representation of that turning point, if it is a turning point for the peasant movement?
I came from the peasant movement. I mean, I'm happy that you raised that point, because there was a debate about the whole notion of having the farmers march to Manila, express their protest on certain issues in Manila, has been debatable in the peasant sector. So it's a question of whether you do it in the local milieu rather than bring it in the urban. The issue there was, do you want to create like an atmosphere short of like having an urban uprising, which is, so it's like you're stimulating or you're staging events so that it could appear to have the semblance of an urban uprising. I think that was the debate at that time.
whether they had been pushed too far or
Yes, and considering that, they're not armed, they're not ready to defend themselves, if I may say so, that was a turning point in terms of doing some rethinking on how to, yes, what would be effective and more sustainable strategies of delivering the messages of the peasant sector. In a way, was an opportunity to reflect on what strategies should be employed by the peasant movement, the open peasant movement, mass movement, expressing their legitimate grievances.
going back to EDSA 1986 and even earlier to like the Lakbayan March in '83, I think it is, which is a similar mass action, mass rally, has sectors of the urban poor and I think peasant sectors participating. Um, it seems to me that there's in a way, a repetition of the Lakbayan in 1987. Um, well, in 1986, you could say that there was a failure of the movement to um, put proper emphasis on the electoral domain or the electoral struggle. Um, was 87 a repetition of like 83, 84 mass rallies? Was there a debate about the electoral arena after 86? Was it not a debate until after 87?
83 and 84. I remember there was a boycott movement too, right? Yes. So there was a boycott movement against the election. So that's part of the Lakbayan. I remember because I participated in the march from Central Luzon, Manila to Central Luzon. So the 87 is very different. I don't think it's comparable. So certainly, like they said, the democratic space relatively opened up post EDSA. I wouldn't say that it was a repeat, but it was just to emphasize or just to put across the message to the people, not just to the government, that the same issues have stayed with us, and that there are members in the government, or there are members of the elite who have made sure that the policies of the government continue to protect the interests of the landed as well as those who are in big business. And therefore, the message is that basic sectors such as the labor as well as the peasant groups will continue to assert for what is rightfully theirs. So I think it's reminding the people that we should never get the illusion that things have changed since Marcos fled the country. That yes, the basic problems are still very much around.
I guess what I was trying to get at was there's a similarity in terms of political tactics or political forms with the mass rally of 83, 84, and 87. But the political coalition building that was happening in the boycott 83, 84 is the political constellation has changed in 87.
Yes, because some of the members of the social movement have clearly changed their allegiance and have aligned with the Cory administration. And because she did a brilliant move of appointing some of them in her own cabinet. So it was really a confusing situation for a lot of the people. Because if you see progressives in the government, then, you would expect that, things will change for the better. I mean, I know that there have been some good changes, but largely, the policies still were anti-poor. There's, of course, the low intensity conflict that was also under Cory's government was the strategy in dealing with the insurgency. So there were still human rights violations, something which you wouldn't expect. But obviously, the military still, was able to flex its muscle. And because Cory trusted the military so well, so they were allowed to, continue exercising some of their action against opposition groups. Yeah.
What's striking for this period of time is the involvement of artists in politics. I was surprised when I learned that Lino Broca actually sat on the Constitutional Commission. What's happening with this Concerned Artists of the Philippines from 83, 84 through 87?
I think the Concerned Artists of the Philippines was still trying its best to galvanize the support from the artists and present a perspective that all is not well. Again, you have artists who have shifted their allegiance, or not shifted, but who have thrown support to the government. So it was a difficult time, I think, for the Concerned Artists of the Philippines because it was a house divided. I mean, that is really one of the challenges post EDSA, that people were confused. Like, are they going to throw their full support to a government that promises fundamental change, or for those who believe that a change of guards wouldn't do much because it's really fundamentally the system which is flawed and therefore would produce the same policies and action, and therefore it wouldn't be very beneficial to the people in the long run.
What did that look like, and what was the confusion when the opposition no longer has this sort of figure to oppose?
If I recall it right, this is where Asia Visions tried to explore other issues that in a way presented that issues and problems remain. For example, Migrante. So they started, with an invitation of migrant group based in Hong Kong. They presented, the problem with this export labor policy of the government. So again, it puts out the message that the economy is not sustainable because it depends on, the remittances of the overseas Filipino workers. At the same time that this is happening, they are being exploited and oppressed, and some of them are even violated, while working overseas. So, and then again, through Tata Celo, they presented that agrarian problems still remain. And that's why, even children, are in bondage because they are paid for the loans that their parents have incurred through the landlords or the loan sharks. So things like that. So I think it was not so much emphasizing now the role of Marcos, but rather that there are fundamental policies, there are fundamental systems that are maintaining all these problems. And therefore, with or without Marcos, these issues need to be addressed. Yes.
Can you explain a little bit more what the Tata Celo is?
So Tata Celo is it's a short story written by Rogelio Sicat. So Lito adapted that story to present the agrarian issues in the contemporary period. So he contemporarized short story that was written in the 1950s. And so he made use of professional actors to enact the scenes out of the story, out of the play. And because the actors were very, very good, were very, very effective. So it was like using the genre of soap, like soap operas, which Filipinos are fond of, to deliver across the message that whether it was in the 50s or in the 80s when he did that, these things are persistent. Tata Celo is about a farmer who was forced to borrow money from his landlord because of, I think one of the family members got sick. In exchange for that, one of the daughters had to work for the landlord. And I think, if I recall it right, I think the daughter was abused. And that's the reason why Tata Celo, I think, killed the landlord. So Tata Celo was imprisoned because of what he did to the landlord. So that was the plot. In the process, the issues then unfolded were revealed on, why they fell into this cycle of, bad debts that pushed them to greater poverty, etc.
So Lito sort of adapted that concept as a structure in his documentary work.
Yes. To present agrarian issues. So again, this was post-Marcos. So it's not about Marcos anymore, but it's about the system, the feudal character of semi-feudal, to be exact, semi-feudal character of the agrarian sector in the Philippines, which affects 80% of the Filipino population.
Would you say that Bernal and Broca were similarly motivated? I guess you could see, especially with Broca, the stories do appear that you have rural migrants to the city who become enmeshed in
I
a
think
quagmire.
so. I think so. I mean, both of them, came from the province, experienced, urban living, but their hearts, have strong affinities with the rural, with the gentle folks. So they have a soft spot for this provincianos. Yes. So I think you're right in that Lito has been influenced. Lito and Lino have sort of reinforced that strong bondage and affinity with rural issues, and every opportunity to present it to the public so that they can understand and build solidarity with the rural folks, they would make use.
Who was the audience for Asia Visions, and was it more middle class, or it sounds like also there were screenings in the provinces or in rural areas to a certain extent?
At the get-go, Asia Visions tended to target the urban population. So these would be students, workers, middle class in general. So because these documentaries were also shown in forums attended by mostly middle class. That was the initial audience. But eventually, when they were able to acquire projection machines to show it in communities, they were able to exhibit the films in urban poor settings, in urban poor communities. And then I heard that eventually they too were able to share it in rural communities. So I think funding and technology had a lot to do with it, because you needed that to be able to project it.
Were they
to a
working
screen.
with the mass movement at that time to the exhibitions?
Yes, yeah. As far as I am aware, they were. So they were like linking with people's organizations or NGOs were involved in awareness raising. They didn't just walk in a community and so it had to be something organized and coordinated.
There's an article that Lido publishes in the Dilliman Review. Lido.
Alito, okay.
Yes, it's let me see if I can find it here. It's called Alternative Cinema Developments and Prospects. I think it was published in 1986.
Okay.
Where he talks about this question of alternative cinema and what it might mean. The main idea seems to be alternative cinema is experimenting, replicating, and discovering rather than exploiting reality. And then he calls it the new cinema, or again, alternative cinema, where short films are more a source for the alternative cinema. Then he talks about two tendencies for these short films that comprise the new cinema. Cinema is art and cinema realism, or cinema is reality. And then the major issue of censorship. Like these films would, I guess, be opening up a space for viewers that wasn't available in the mainstream media. With the goal remaining full democratization of cinema and the popularity of its use. Was Asia Vision successful in implementing this vision that's put out in this article?
So Asia Visions was established to help or to contribute in challenging this status quo and making sure that it could produce like a medium that would provoke people to like question the things that were happening and what needed to change. So in a way, it was meant to be a catalyst for change, changing perspectives, changing attitudes, and even behaviors. In terms of so definitely not to exploit. And then the second point about whether it is cinema, it's for cinema or is it for art?
I guess art films versus the more straight documentaries is the tension that he's discussing here.
And that's why at some point he was fascinated with, I don't know if it's used now, faction. So combination of fiction and fact and fiction. So it's fiction based on facts. Yeah. Is that being used now? Is that legitimate? He was fascinated with that. Like he's saying that, so Tata Sela, for example, is a good example. It's based on a fictional story, but it's inspired by facts. So then you combine the two. So there's art in the sense that in terms of storytelling, but using also facts or evidence-based, yes, reality. So and I think that marries the tension between just art as well as yes, something just cinema for art or cinema to expose reality. So I think his fascination was how do you combine the two?
Right.
So that there need not be any tension or contradiction.
Is there some synthesis?
Yes.
Was there some tension between that approach that we're describing and an approach that's more governed by the collective?
That is something that I didn't have the glimpse in terms of, because I don't work with Asia Vision, so I don't actually see them in motion. So like how really is the collective? I mean, strictly speaking, they are a collective, but in the creative process, how is that collectivity played out? It's something that I haven't witnessed or observed. But knowing my husband, he tends to be more individual in his approach. So he would, in terms of execution, so in terms of ideas, in the ideation process, he would have like a collective to provide ideas, inspiration, etc. And then he would tend to put it together, execute it in how he edits, images he chooses, etc., down to the music, etc. So I think then someone else will help him execute it in terms of help him out in the editing, etc. But knowing Lito, he really knows frame by frame what to use. How to the sequence, etc., which music to use. So yeah, I don't think the collective process, I think, is in the big picture, but in the details, I don't think it's collective.
I guess that leads me to think about this question of democratizing cinema.
Yeah.
And if you democratize the process, how does the detail work get done? Right? Something that can't be resolved through some maybe there can be democratic mediation, but at some point you need a synthesis through an individual perspective or experience.
Yeah. And I think it sits well with Lito because of his personality. He's very introspective. So unlike some who would like to discuss it, verbalize everything, he is really more, he goes into deep thinking, and then that's when he has his aha moments, and then he executes.
Does this feed into Lito eventually leaving Asia Visions?
His leaving had nothing to do with the collective approach or weak collective approach, but it was more of the vision. Lito left Asia Visions because at that time there was pressure from the progressive movement for them to act as like the, how do you say that? So they would be covering all the rallies, mass actions, etc. So it was more like straight documentary, and at that time Lito was already thinking of injecting art into their productions, because he thinks that people will be bored if it's just straight documentary, especially if it's just about filming all these mass actions. So he thought that, yes, so again, as an artist, he thought that there are some themes, there are some subjects that are best presented using other creative means rather than documentaries. So, and he felt strongly about that. And he wasn't warm to the idea of turning into like a documentation group for the progressive movement. That's why he decided to leave.
So all the way through, he still had this sort of the cinema verite and this creative synthesis of documentary and cinema in mind.
Yeah. So things like that. So he wanted to explore other forms and not just be stuck with just straight documentary or just documentation. It scared him. It scared him if that's going to be the direction, because he knows but he for himself wouldn't want to watch just pure documentation. Right. So he said it's not his cup of tea. So he said that if they want it as an organization, then he will respect the decision, and then he will just leave ability.
I guess there's the films in a way that they leave traces of the mass movement that wouldn't they might not be available at least for someone like me otherwise.
Yeah.
For yourself, I guess reflecting back on this moment, do you feel the same way that the documentaries do sort of reflect what's happening and changes that are going on in the movement and how people think about it?
Definitely. I think in the documentaries, we would observe that it was a vibrant mass movement then compared to now. So, in terms of numbers, and it was not just in Metro Manila but all over the Philippines, there was just this spontaneity of, action and solidarity. It was not just, and that's, I think, what's one of the things I've observed now is that there is less of the solidarity across different sectors in supporting certain issues. So, for example, in the past, so this was during Marcos' time and shortly after Marcos' time, you would see a broad representation of sectors from the church, professionals, students, trade union, peasant groups, fisher folks, etc., supporting certain issues, a specific issue. Whereas now, apart from lower numbers, there would be less solidarity. So I think I don't know if that is indifference. There is like more indifference now compared to before, or there are other expressions maybe of support, but definitely not in the streets, not protesting in the streets. So I think rightly or wrongly, from what I observe, a lot of the support now, or a lot of the activism is happening in social media.